the Oprah story, I gather, was a really big moment in your life in the sense that it was an arrival that you've said in other interviews, and for you that you've written 12 books, and this one was the one that I think has meant the most to you.
I think that's right. Although we probably save spots for all our children when we need them one time or another.
That's true.
Yeah, but it was something of a watershed, as maybe only one or two other of my books have been. And when I look back at the trail of the 11 novels that preceded it, I can see signs of working toward this story that connects the human and the non-human. But it came as a surprise as I was working on it. I didn't go into the project with a clear vision of where I would end up. I guess we rarely do. But at the other end of
that's the fun part, is the exploration.
Yeah, it sure is. I mean, there's a Redke Villanelle with the refrain, "We learn by going where we have to go." Yeah, and it's the case for all of us every time out. But what I learned this time was that as writers of the present, I had lost my way a little bit. I had stumbled into a vision of our existence that didn't go as far beyond the human or the social as it might want to do, and it might need to do if the purpose of our books is to say who we are, where we've been dropped down, what we can do about it. We need to recover something of an older mode of storytelling with regard to the neighbors, with regard to those whose means of existence here on Earth are very unlike our own.
Uh-huh. And I mean, people have said, and I think it's true, that the trees are really characters in your book. Like the Mima, that one, is so real to me, like a real person.
Thank you, Edmund. It was another discovery that I made along the way, that in order to tell this story properly, the story of the relationship between the human and the non-human, that I had to have protagonists. I had to give agency to both individual trees and landscapes, collections, forests, groves. And while that was brand new for me, as I did the legwork for the book and as I dug into older modes of storytelling, it occurred to me that isn't out of line for a lot of world literature, for a lot of world history, to actually give agency, to personify, not to personify, actually that's probably the wrong word, but to animate.
Give personality to it, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, well, do you know Janáček's operas? I don't know.
The one that's often translated as Cunning Little Vixen, for sure. Yeah.
Because, I mean, there, a little frog is a character, and I mean, they're very real, those characters. There's also a very dark side to this book. I mean, for people who are optimists about saving nature, it's kind of a dark story.
Well, I'm afraid the dark story is the one that we've been telling for a long time now. And, you reach a point, I think, also in every book, whatever it is that you're trying to do, and the story that we strive for is trying to make this unholy balance. I think one of my characters, Patricia Westford, says, between things that are useful, hopeful, and true.
Yeah.
And it's tough to hit that trifecta. It's tough to know when to back off of the hopeful and say, actually, this is what we're looking at.
What's really happening.
Yeah. It's a juggling act, I think. You can't there's no good in telling a story that completely overwhelms the reader either, and and deprives the reader of any chance of continuance or
Yeah, this is a good balance between those two, I think. I mean, the people are the main characters are idealistic, but some of them suffer a lot of pain for their ideals.
Sure.
And there's a lot of suicide in the book. I mean, there must be 7 or 8 characters who, maybe not that many.
No, but you're right. It is a recurring motif, and other violence does recur in motivic form as well throughout the book. And this question of transformation, the Ovidian metamorphosis that is a kind of motif throughout the book too, is offset against the grimness and the darkness of the terminal choices that people are making. But the prevalence of suicide, I think, has something to do with trying to depict a culture that, from the perspective of environmental sanity, is itself
killing itself.
Somewhat suicidal. That's right.
Yeah, right. I think so too. I thought of that, and I thought, in a way, it's parallel to what's happening to the tree. Is what's happening to the people that they're committing suicide. And you do say all good stories kill you a little. And that was an interesting quote, because I think that the Italian readers will like the fact that it's not just a happy story. I mean, because Italy has gone through so much now with the pandemonium. And do you think one can read your book in a different way after this COVID problem?
Yeah, there are some ways in which the book anticipates the pandemic and anticipates the ways in which an out of balance approach to living here on a living planet will necessarily call in its debts down the line. And I have had readers send me back identifications of passages in the book that seem to be somewhat prescient about the pandemic and about the rise of zoonotic diseases. Of course, it's not prescient on anybody's part. It's not like we haven't seen this coming for decades. And the precursors of this pandemic are close enough and intense enough for us to, we should have been paying attention. So I don't see this as an act of prediction at all. I see it as an act of memory, really.
Memory, yeah. Exactly. That's very good. And one of the interesting things in your writing is that you write about all these different professions, you seem to know everything about everything. But you certainly know a lot about all the professions of these people. And I majored in Chinese in college,
right.
and I was struck by your character, Ma Lin. Is that her name?
Yeah, Mimi Ma, the American.
Yeah, Mima. Yeah, and how she and the whole story of the father bringing the scroll to America and the 3 rings, all that was, I thought, brilliant. And the detail in your work is always so authentic. And whether it's people who are doing amateur theatricals in the Midwest, or whether they're but you've in your other books too, you've written lots about genetics, pharmaceuticals, artificial intelligence, music, photography, neurology. I mean, you like to explore the world of fact, even though your work is so mythical. At least this book is very mythical.
I've often thought that I went into writing as a way of not having to make a career decision. That there were so many things that interested me in so many ways that I thought it might be interesting to make a living and to engage the world, that, when I stumbled upon this place where, oh boy, you actually don't have to make an exclusive decision. You can go on, living vicariously all these roads not taken,
In a way, it's like the character Neely, who has all these alternative lives that he can create.
Yeah, I see that story as a kind of metaphor for this path of narrative creation that we have followed, that you and I have followed. But I, the truth of the matter is, as I approach the age of 63, that I know precious little. And, I think that the longer I am away from actually making a living through, a specific skill, the less confident I am about any of my real knowledge.
I'm sorry. I lost your voice for a moment.
The longer away I am from making a living with the real world skill, the less confident I am about any of my real world knowledge. But it remains a perpetual joy for me as a writer to get that sense of vicarious pleasure, to learn enough about a discipline to see how the world looks through the eyes of a person who knows those things and who feels compelled by those things. As Bakhtin said, every act of depicting is itself a depiction. We have to see the expertise and the passion and the desire and the knowledge that drives our characters in order to understand what the world looks like to those characters.
One of the nice things about your writing is that the characters are intelligent. I mean, so many people write books, especially playwrights, where they're slightly looking down on the characters, and you watch them kind of stumble toward a realization you, the member of the audience, had from the very beginning. And that kind of, I find that deplorable. I think characters should be intelligent, and we should respect them.
Well, I have over the years taken criticism by certain kinds of readers who say there's a lot of head in these books, but not enough heart in these books. And it just seems like an incredibly artificial dichotomy to me. We are passionate about what we know. And everyone alive has a kind of genius of living. And they acquire an incredibly complicated expertise and set of skills and knowledges with which to navigate through the world. And that's the key to revealing that person and making them come alive on the page. What are their hopes and fears and dreams? And we do share a common set, but we also distinguish ourselves by this perpetual act of becoming good at something, becoming, obsessed with something and passionate about it.
I think yeah. And I think that one of the things that is that Kierkegaard said that people aren't just a product of their historical moment. They also have their own individual personality.
That's right.
And that's sort of like what you're saying, I think.
Yeah.
And
I'm glad you invoke him. He makes my book look a little cheerier in comparison.
Right. Yeah. I liked the character of Patsy Westerford. I thought, she's very interesting because she's the one who really discovers that social life of trees, right?
Yeah, and she's also interesting in her interpersonal relationships too. Her childhood impairment and her isolation, her both imposed and elected isolation from her peers growing up, creates in her a kind of suspicion of the human race that was quite delightful to try to inhabit and represent. And it makes her more perceptive of the complexities and compulsions and beauties of the non-human world. But she is still a human being, and she suffers this time-honored battering by the alpha male gatekeepers in her discipline. And this is a story that I borrowed from several sources. Historical researchers, female researchers who were driven out of the field or mimicked or otherwise castigated for making observations that weren't being individual and hierarchical norms of knowing. So she's interested in that regard. And I also like her interpersonal relationship with the man that she ends up marrying, and their unique, seemingly, but probably not all that unusual, decision that intimacy doesn't require constant contact. I like this character who is so self-assured and self-reliant and self-dependent, so at home in the living world, that her deepest and most intense and most personal, most loving relationship can occur over lunchtime, every day. That there's just this, this balance between knowing the world through our other human beings and knowing the world on our own in a broader environment, in a broader sense.
Yes, I think that's really interesting. Well, do you have a researcher, or do you do all your research yourself?
I wouldn't pay somebody to do the most fun part of the whole process. I don't really embark on a book unless I've fallen in love with the domain of the book. You have written real nonfiction and heavily researched nonfiction, and the pleasures of pursuing those obsessions. The mystery, the detective story of
biographies. That's certainly interesting. It is interesting, and but I'm a kind of library rat. I love to read books. But my happiest moment was being in the British Library and being ordered up all these books and they bring them to your, when I was doing research for a book. And I love research, but I don't know if other people do.
Well, this one just consumed me, and I ended up reading, well over 120 book-length studies of trees, and that's not including the scholarly articles or the magazines or the web material. And the reality is, I fell so deeply under the spell of tree communication and tree community and tree society and interdependence that I'm still reading about it now, 2 years after publication of the book. So, it's not onerous at all. And I think the real trick is how to incorporate that material into a fictional frame and give the reader the same natural passion that you felt while finding it all. And so it doesn't feel intrusive. It doesn't feel at odds with the personal story. It's just part of the same propulsion, the same version, the same light.
I think you write very memorable visual scenes that we can remember forever, really. Like that family in the Midwest, the pioneers with their chestnut tree. That is so powerful in the way they take pictures of it every year for 120 years or whatever it is. Yeah. And that's very, very memorable. And of course, living up in Mima is very, and I think also the scenes of the father giving the scrolls and the 3 rings to his daughters. It's really like something out of Shakespeare or something.
Well, as you know, this whole, to make a book, we were pirating everything, and we are magpies. Yeah. We just fly around and we grab things and we bring them back to the nest and we recombine them. And you mentioned Mimi Ma and said that the Chinese scholar that's still in use felt that the detail. Well, that's because she had the real world precursor, and I did make a composite character based on people who had like those experiences. And seen at the top of
have you known somebody like your other character who died and then came back to life?
Yes, that was also based on a composite of two other people. The Olivia Vandergraff story where she electrocutes herself and comes back and has this sense of, vocation that she didn't have in her, pre.
She was just a silly girl before, and then all of a sudden she becomes this kind of medium, hearing these voices and with a mission.
Yeah.
I thought that very interesting. But you have a respect for all of your characters, which I think is so powerful and interesting, because I think so many writers are condescending to their characters, and they feel they're bigger and better than they themselves are than their characters. But I love the way that you show three-dimensional people in all their dimensions.
Oh, bless you.
Yeah, but your love of trees has caused you to move from the West Coast to where do you live in the Smoky Mountains?
So I live on the northwest edge of the national park. On the Tennessee side of Great Smoky Mountain National Park, but quite a bit west of the big, the Gatlinburg Circus, the main entrance to the park. It's a big place, and it's an incredibly rich and diverse place. It's often called the most biologically diverse area of land of its size outside the tropics. And that makes every day an adventure, and every season an adventure, and every altitude and solar aspect a different kind of place. Behind me you see the big spruce fir forest at the top part of the park, and there are 6 radically different kinds of forest within the confines of the park, and more species of trees than there are in all of Europe, from Portugal to the Baltic states. So it's quite an amazing spot. I went there just on a research trip for the book to see primary forest, to see what old growth Eastern American woodland looked like. I'm an Easterner, or Midwesterner / Easterner, and grew up in these forests and thought I knew what they looked like, but I didn't until I went to the Smokies and saw what an uncut one looked like, and what a lot of our country looked like prior to the arrival of white people.
White people, the horrible white people.
Yeah.
Here we are. One of the things I think will surprise Italian readers is that forests in Europe tend to be very tidy and with no underbrush, and what Trump admires. And I think your depiction of a living complex forest, and your idea that a dead tree is a hotel for hundreds of animals and living beings, is fascinating, really. And I think these messy forests in America are really not at all in the European experience.
Yeah. I was going to mention that when we were talking about how laden the book is with mortality and suicide, that the flip side of the darkness of that book is this vision of plant consciousness, tree consciousness, ecosystem consciousness, where death is not a tragic, horrible insertion, accident into an otherwise well-managed, well-regulated system. Is the engine, just the mother of beauty, as even said. It is not only the place where life comes back into the system, but it is an integral part of the constant exchanges and reciprocities that all the other living elements of the system take part in. And it is our fear of death, I think, that is behind this vision of human destiny, this idea that somehow we can master and control all the variables. And at the end of the day, if we get enough technological power, we can fix the one design flaw of life called death. It's not a design flaw. It's not a bug. It is a feature. And it's what...
One of my best friends is an oncologist, and he said to me something that struck me the other day. He said that cancer is the way nature kills us all.
Yeah.
Because, it's not some aberration that we should be cured, although that's what his life work is curing cancer. But he says, in truth, it's the way we get rid of these beings that have lived too long.
And as an agent of death itself is the supreme transformation. It's the supreme way of making new combinations, of making room for new life, and of continuing this endless metamorphosis that the planet has been on for a very, very long time.
I think that's another aspect of your book that will be very appealing to Italian readers, is your immense culture, like your references to Ovid and the metamorphosis of Ovid. I mean, that will please Europeans because I lived in Paris 16 years, and in Italy many years. But so I kind of know that they'll appreciate that aspect of your book.
I have to say, being called erudite or cultured by Edmund White is, there's a little bit of the pot calling the kettle black here, but I am deeply honored. For me, again, there can sometimes be in American literature of my generation a faux folksiness, a kind of willful narrowing of the cultural lens. And where's the fun? And where's the joy? And where's the forward motion? I feel my deep pleasure in the past and in cultural legacy is in no way morbid. It's an eternal source of recombination in its own right. It's a way of looking forward to new combinations.
Yeah, I mean, that runs through the whole book, is that feeling of one thing becoming another. The people change because, like, that woman dies, and then she comes back as a different person.
Yeah.
And, there's...
and that's the way culture and literature work as well, right?
Exactly.
We're not trapped.
Because so many people want to preserve everything, and so it can't possibly change, but it must change.
Yeah, but in order for it to change in an intelligible and a useful way, we can't be amnestic. We can't be amnesic about it. I mean, we have to know what the trajectory looks like in order to extend the trajectory.
That's true too. Yes, that's true. Did you ever, like your character Neely, did you ever work in those alternative universes?
Oh yeah.
I know you were a computer expert, right?
I was a programmer and a systems analyst, and I wrote a great deal of code when I was a younger man. And the worlds that he's describing, in fact, I had great fun kind of retelling the history of the early personal computer movement through him.
When he and his father are experimenting with all that stuff, that was fascinating.
Yeah, that was me as a little boy. In very different circumstances, but coming of age in those years, and teaching myself how to program as a teenager, and then making a living as a programmer. The great delight of writing this book was going back and recovering old passions, old lives, and combining them with lives not taken, the lives of friends, the lives of imagined people,
Yeah.
and creating this twisting, reciprocally connected ecosystem of all the things that, that I feel passionate about.
The people are like trees in the sense that they have underground roots that touch each other and feed each other.
Yeah, and there's over the air signaling and mycorrhizal underground connection and ramification, and that's if anything, in my mind, if I could ask for anything on the part of a reader who dives into this pretty thick book and makes it to the other end, it would be just that, to have them experience or re-experience a sense of just how many uncountable connections their life has had with people of other places.
I think that's so true. That's so true. I mean, I'm sure as a writer, people will ask, will treat you as though you have a certain destiny, that you always had the destiny of being a writer. But when you think about the pinball machine chaos of one's life and how one ends up not through any idea of purpose, but as a result of all these accidents, really.
That's absolutely right, and that more than anything, that makes a complete laughing stock of the way that we live when we say, if we can only get enough control, enough mastery, enough technology, we're going to be able to shape and render our own destinies. Well, the last few months have proved a bit of a humbling catfish. It'll see whether we learn anything about giving up the sense of control and returning and accepting the chance, the hazard of living inside the living world.
Yes, that's true. It's amazing that I know that picture very well of the three young men going off for the wedding. That is a great picture, and that kind of made you want to be a novelist.
That's where I got my start. That, seeing that famous photograph by August Sonder when I myself was a young man, and seeing it hanging in a museum in Boston for the first American retrospective of Sonder's photography, and just having this powerful feeling of being the eyes that those eyes were waiting for, and completing that circuit, looking back through the frame and having them look through the frame of time to me. And it's interesting that already in that book, which is about this weird moment in terror and upheaval and change and transformation in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, and all its ramifications at the end of the century, and this participation that I have in that book, the past and present and future all tangled together, talking to each other across time. That same sense is still in Overstory, the long conversation between the past and the present, thinking about time.
That's true. Do you know that poem by Rilke, looking at a cadet picture of my father? You would like this. He's a young man, Rilke, and he's looking at this photograph of his father who's dead, but when he was young as a cadet, and he realizes that the photograph is deteriorating at the same pace that he's dying, that they're both moving in space. Parallel to each other. Anyway, you would like that poem, I think.
I will look up and read it. But you bring to mind one of the challenges of trying to write a story where we have our sense of 70 and we tend to pay attention to things that are kind of working on our time frame, and we're not really good at connecting ourselves into long time backwards or into long time forwards, and to set aside that rate of story, that story, set aside it, the story of creatures, some of whom individual minds in the United States that were born before human beings learned how to write. And how do you wrap a story together that, where the creatures operate on such different time frames?
I know you often talk about how they'll take centuries to communicate the trees, and how they're the product of 4 billion years, and that we share 1/4 of our genes with trees, and all that is so fascinating. Well, it was such wonderful fun to talk to you, and I'm glad that this book is being introduced to the Italian audience. Thank you.
It was a great pleasure, Edmund. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Richard.